This is a podcast produced by Ashridge Business School.
So to finish up, I'd like to illustrate this with a little story that I first heard David White speak about at the Oxford Literary Festival a couple of years ago. David is an author and a poet who spends an awful lot of his time in organisations working with senior teams on the subjects that we're discussing today. David was telling a story about the time he went to visit a chief executive of a computer chip manufacturer, and David was his personal coach. It just so happened that on the day that David went to visit him, it was Bring Your Sons Into Work Day. So the CEO had his son with him all day, shadowing what he was doing. And David sat in on the various meetings that the CEO had, and he followed the CEO and his son around for the day. At the end of the day, the CEO was sat in the boardroom with all of his vice presidents around him. And at the end of the meeting, he looked very proud and very CEO-like in terms of the stuff that he'd done during the day, and he felt that he'd produced a remarkable amount of value for the organisation. So he's sitting at the end of the table and he says to his son, "Son, what do you think of what I do?" And his son said nothing. So the CEO said, "Son, what do you think of what I do?" The son said, "Well, Dad, I haven't seen you do anything." At which point the CEO is thinking, "Goodness me, I'm stood in front of all of my vice presidents here and my son doesn't get it." So in that moment, the CEO decides that he really needs to nail this, otherwise his credibility with his vice presidents is going to be lost. And he says to his son, "Son, out there, there's a conversation. I need to know whether they want more chips, fewer chips, larger chips, smaller chips, or frankly, no chips at all. And if we don't have a conversation in this organization that's in conversation with that larger dialogue out there in the real world, we have no business." He said, "Son, I'm chief storyteller around here." At which point the vice presidents and the chief executive draw a big breath. And the chief executive can't quite believe what he said, because moments earlier, if he'd have pushed him, he'd have said, "Well, I'm a bean counter, I'm a strategist." In that moment, he epitomized everything we've been talking about in today's podcast. That particular CEO realized that he, and only he, had a principal responsibility for leading the quality of the story in that organization. And that, in that particular instance, was how he decided to define himself.
This podcast was produced by Ashridge Business School.